Something massive just got triggered, and people don't even realize it yet. They think they saw a presidential reaction to a tragedy, a leader furious, decisive, promising to fix a system that failed. They heard the words permanently pause migration, and their brains sorted the moment into a familiar box crackdown. Safety first politics, a presidential promise to redress a security lapse, case closed. But that's the surface. What you're about to hear is a different animal entirely, not a knee-jerk policy response to a single attack, but the opening move in a much larger operation to reorder who counts as American, how the state allocates basic services, and most importantly, who is permitted to belong. This isn't merely restrictive immigration policy, it's an attempt to rewrite the social contract. And once you connect the tactical language, permanent pause, reverse migration, denaturalize with the political timing, and the institutional levers now in motion, you realize the board has tilted in ways most people won't see until it's too late. Let me show you what everyone missed. Grounding reporting, the shooting near the White House, and the president's permanent pause proclamation are reported across outlets. See Reuters, AP, Time, Guardian reporting for the core public facts. Here's what actually happened, stripped of the noise. On November 26, two National Guard members on duty in Washington, D.C. were ambushed. One, Specialist Sarah Beckstrom, described as 20 years old in multiple reports, later died. The other remains critically injured. Authorities say the suspect is an Afghan national who entered the U.S. through a resettlement pathway after serving in roles tied to U.S. counter-operations overseas. The event immediately became political fuel. Within hours, the White House pivoted from mourning to policy action. The president posted and spoke in tones that combined grief with a sweeping set of proposals, a permanent pause on migration from what he labeled third world countries, a review of green cards from countries of concern, suspension of some visa issuances, and rhetoric about stripping federal benefits or even citizenship from people deemed incompatible with national values. Officials announced pauses on asylum decisions and stepped-up reviews of certain admissions. That sequence, incident, immediate executive-style proclamation, administrative review is now unfolding in real time. Crucially, internal documents reported by journalists suggest the previous intake effort that resettled certain evacuees had operational confusion cases where identities weren't properly documented and where screening was incomplete. Those procedural failures are now the exact levers the administration points to as justification for dramatic corrective policy. Whether the scale of the failure is as large as claimed is a separate question. What matters is that officials now have a narrative that links a security failure to a specific population and an administrative fix. So the core facts we'll build on are simple. Tragic ambush president frames the tragedy as systemic failure, announces a sweeping permanent migration pause, and administrative reviews rhetoric escalates to include culturally charged language. To understand what's really happening here, you need the players, the patterns, and the constraints. Character history, the current president has long used national security and immigration as signature themes. Over previous years, policy layers were built: travel bans, admission caps, selective vetting, and the political coalition supporting hardline measures is broad. Some conservative-based voters who prioritize security, certain suburban constituencies anxious about local crime, and media ecosystems that amplify threat narratives. That history matters. It means the posture taken today is not ad hoc. It's a continuation of an established playbook. The legal and institutional landscape matters too. The president does have significant executive powers over immigration, enforcement, refugee admissions, and visa processing, but there are constraints: statutory rules, judicial review, state, federal pushback, and foreign law and treaty obligations. Permanent executive edicts face litigation, congressional opposition, and international consequences. That means the promise of a total permanent pause is almost certainly going to be litigated, constrained, and operationalized in messy, halting ways rather than as an immediate, airtight shutdown. But legal friction doesn't negate political effect. It buys time, legitimizes certain administrative moves, and reshapes public debate. Timing pressures, this happens in a high-visibility political cycle. A national tragedy during a holiday amplifies raw emotion. The administration's timing, immediate declaration, dramatic language is calibrated to seize the narrative. That timing is not accidental. When you move fast after a traumatic event, you harden public memory and channel outrage into policy framing before critics can fully marshal counterarguments. Precedent, we've seen similar cascades before: attacks turned into broad policy swings, targeted vetting amplified into blanket bans. But there's a difference now. The rhetoric pairs administrative measures, review green cards, pause asylum, with cultural existential claims incompatible with Western civilization, a rhetorical escalation that blurs legal categories with civilizational judgments. That bridge from administrative action to civilizational framing is the strategic pivot to watch. Finally, the domestic landscape. States like Minnesota are invoked as proof points in the president's narrative. Whether the characterization is accurate or exaggerated, invoking a specific state and local anxieties localizes the national narrative and draws in governors, mayors, and congresspeople, forcing local officials into response positions and making the moment a federated fight. So what's really happening here? Because the surface story, a president reacting to a security failure, misses the deeper game entirely. The real question isn't whether this move reduces short-term risk. The question is whether it is designed to achieve four strategic wins at once. 1. Reshape the electorate's perception of who deserves state protection. Reallocate public resources away from non-citizens and toward a core constituency. Institutionalize a legal pathway for large-scale removals and vetting that outlast a single administration. And 4. Force courts, states, and international partners into defensive posture, buying the administration time and asymmetric leverage. Think about it strategically. If you're the actor making this proclamation, you know several constraints: courts, domestic political pluralities, and international backlash. You also know what opponents will do: call out xenophobia, mount legal challenges, mobilize immigrant communities and allied institutions. So you steer the debate not to legal niceties, but to public emotions, safety, fairness, and resource scarcity. Path A, the obvious play, would be to quietly tighten vetting, launch a targeted internal audit, and brief Congress behind closed doors. That solves some administrative faults, but doesn't reshape the public story. It cedes the moral high ground and signals administrative competence, not political force. Path B, the 4D chess play being attempted, is to escalate, to make sweeping promises, to tie administrative action to identity politics. The move is risky, but when it lands, it accomplishes several things simultaneously. First, legitimation. By linking the shooting to an alleged systemic vetting failure and then promising permanent structural changes, the administration recasts administrative discretion as moral necessity. That makes subsequent bureaucratic measures, green card reviews, visa suspensions, look like obvious emergency responses rather than partisan policy. Result, the state rebrands enforcement as civic protection. Second, resource reallocation. Announcing the withdrawal of federal benefits and public services from non-citizens is a signal to state and local governments and to voters that policy will shift funding priorities. Even before budgets change, the political framing pressures agencies to reprioritize grant guidance and regulatory attention. Third, data extraction and targeting. A green card review and visa pause isn't just a pause, it is an opportunity to compile lists, to cross-check databases, to create administrative categories that can later be used for enforcement or removal. Bureaucracies love a mandate. Give one painted in national security terms, and you get sweeping data collection with fewer internal objections. Fourth, narrative ownership. The administration intentionally created a sequence: attack, moral outrage, presidential emergency, administrative action. That cadence seizes media cycles and compresses opposition response time. In the days after the proclamation, opponents scramble to reframe the story. The administration advances policy while the opposition reacts. That's not reactive politics. That's offensive agenda setting. Watch the moves that followed the proclamation: immediate pauses on asylum decisions and reviews of green cards, targeted visa halts for specific nationalities, and public rhetoric about reverse migration. These are not isolated, they are coordinated instruments, legal orders, administrative directives, and rhetorical escalations that reinforce one another. But there's an additional, more revealing layer. While the country fixated on the single shooting and the president's dramatic post, three related things were happening beneath the radar. First, officials quietly began administrative reviews of admissions and green cards, the paperwork that builds enforcement lists. Second, allied state officials were being prepped publicly to receive federal demands to cooperate on removals, making future deportation logistics easier. Third, sympathetic media voices began running human interest reframings that centered resource scarcity and safety rather than civil liberties. Coincidence? Not likely. Coordination. By the end of the first news cycle, opponents had to choose between A, immediately condemning the rhetoric and getting painted as uncaring about safety, or B, demanding due process, and being portrayed as soft on risk. Either choice strains the opposition's narrative. That cascade is the real political power play. Create binary public choices that force opponents into defensive moves, while you set up administrative machinery that moves regardless of courtroom outcomes. Lesson learned, it's often not the legal decree that matters most, it's the sequence of events and the narrative architecture that converts outrage into durable policy changes. So what happens next? This is barely round one. Here's what I see coming: specific falsifiable moves. First, short-term 30-90 days, expect intensified administrative action. The Department of Homeland Security and USCIS will issue emergency guidance to freeze certain processing queues, expand vetting flags, and standardize country of concern lists. You'll see an uptick in watch list cross-checks and requests to state and local law enforcement for records that facilitate removals. Lawsuits will arrive quickly, but administrative momentum will have already generated lists and data that persist even if court orders temporarily restrain removals. Second, medium term, 3-12 months, look for legislative and budgetary fights. The administration will pressure Congress for statutory cover, expanded grounds for denaturalization, narrower definitions of eligibility for benefits, or increased funding for deportation operations. Whether Congress grants that will hinge on midterm political calculations and public polling, but the administration's framing will make inaction equals insecurity. Expect state governors to be courted for cooperation. Some will comply, others will resist setting up patchwork enforcement across the country. Third policy move, 12-24 months. Incremental institutional shifts, not sweeping, instantaneous purges. The real long game is building an apparatus that institutionalizes selective denaturalization, administrative revocation of statuses, and broad eligibility vetting for public benefits. That will be carried out as targeted measures but applied through opaque administrative rules that make broad impacts possible without explicit new legislation. Fourth, the wild card political, a judicial order or international rebuke could temporarily halt parts of the machinery. But here's the kicker: even a judicial rebuke is convertible into political capital. The administration will portray judicial obstruction as elite interference with security. That gives fuel for further executive action and potential legislative pushes to immunize administrative moves. The wild card that could fully break or accelerate the strategy would be coordinated state resistance. For example, sanctuary states refusing to cooperate or mass civil society mobilization that raises the political cost high enough to chill federal enforcement. Deeper trend. This is not simply about immigration law. It's about how a political operation uses a crisis to build permanent administrative architecture. The goal is not only removal, it's normative, to make certain populations administratively second class, less eligible for services, easier to surveil, and harder to naturalize. The stakes are enormous. The combination of administrative speed, data collection, and public narrative control compounds over time. 5 years from now, historians might not remember the exact executive orders. They will remember that a crisis of security turned into a new administrative normal where citizenship and access were securitized in ways that made reversal much harder. That's the risk and the goal. So what does this mean for you? The universal lesson: power in complex systems doesn't operate like simple policy debates. It operates through sequences: emotional trigger, rhetorical framing, administrative mandate, data creation, institutional lock-in. This is political jujitsu. Use the opponent's shock to produce leverage that lasts beyond the immediate moment. You just watched a public tragedy turned into a dramatic policy pivot. By conventional lights, this was a safety move, but within hours, through coordinated messaging and administrative edicts, the event morphed into a project for redefining belonging. That is the technique: convert immediacy into architecture. Is that inspiring or terrifying? Depends on your vantage. For supporters, this looks like decisive action to protect citizens and restore order. For critics, it looks like a dangerous path toward collective punishment and erosion of due process. The critical split: do you see chaos or strategy? Do you see a single angry decision or a coordinated operation to reconfigure the machinery of governance? That answer is the more useful predictor of what comes next. Here's the cliffhanger. When the administration's immediate legal push meets the first major court injunction or the first coordinated state refusal to comply, who will control the narrative then? Will the story be A, courts protecting civil liberties, or B, judges obstructing national security and enabling risk? The outcome of that framing fight will determine more about the next decade of governance than a single executive order ever could. So ask yourself, when you hear permanent pause, are you hearing a short-term response or the opening salvo of a durable transformation of how the US defines membership and protection. The real question is not whether the policy is lawful today, it's whether the architecture it creates will be reversible tomorrow. Sources and why they matter, the 5 most load-bearing reports. 1. Reuters' immediate reporting on the president's permanently paused announcement and the sequence of administrative moves used to anchor the core policy claim. 2. AP factual reporting on the National Guard shooting and the victims, Sarah Beckstrom and the second soldier, used to anchor the human tragedy at the center of the narrative. 3. Time reporting tying the shooting to government resettlement programs and the broader administrative review, used to ground claims about Operation Allies Welcome connections reported in press. 4. Guardian reporting on the social and rhetorical framing, particularly the president's social media posts and the permanent pause language, used to support claims about rhetoric and public reaction. Al Jazeera, ABC, other outlets corroborating reporting on asylum pauses and green card reviews to show administrative follow-through beyond rhetoric.